The title of the sermon, as you have seen in the bulletin, is "Who is my neighbor?" And for thousands of years, the Christian community has been discussing the question, and which is probably very easy to answer in the sense that, the neighbor is anybody that is within my reach of action, anybody that I see, anybody that I encounter, anybody that I have some kind of interaction with, or that I could have interactions with. But the most difficult part of the question is what Jesus said at the end of the story. Do you remember the last words read here in the scripture reading for today? Go and do likewise. And that is the difficulty for us today, as individuals and as a church. So I chose to talk today not so much about the individual responsibility, but the church responsibility as a group, as a body of believers, as a congregation. Do we have a responsibility to consider the needs of our neighbors, to go and do likewise? And if so, what is to go and do likewise? And in order to address the question, I would like to tell you two stories that I think that will put in context the responsibility of the church to go and do likewise. And I chose one story that is tragic, extremely sad, probably the saddest story that I know of in terms of the history of our church, and another that is a happy story. The sad story is what is known in Adventist history as the Lucy Bayard incident. It happened in 1943. There were two elderly Adventists in New York that were dealing with health problems. The wife, Lucy, was very sick, and the husband decided to take her to Adventist hospital that was specialized on treating that lung disease. And so he knew about the Washington Adventist Hospital, that it was hours away. So he made arrangements by phone. He traveled with his wife from New York to Washington. He arrived in Washington, and through the long journey, the wife got worse and worse. And by the time that she got to the hospital, she could hardly breathe. And he begged the hospital, please take my wife immediately to the emergency room. She's not going to last very long. And the people at the reception initially complied. They put her in a wheelchair and took her to the emergency room. However, as they start looking through the paperwork, through the file, there was a line that said the race, and the clerk noticed that she was an African American. Well, this was 1943, and that hospital only treated white patients. So what did he do? He ran to the emergency room and told them, the doctor and the people that were involved in the care of the lady, sorry, but she's not a white person. She doesn't have the right to be here. Our regulations do not allow us to treat black patients. And well, the husband could not believe. Now, he was very light-skinned, blue eyes. Nobody would guess that he had African-American roots. The wife had a little bit of a tan, but nobody could look at her and say with certainty, well, she's an African-American. So the husband pleaded with the hospital, please, my wife really needs help right now. And they said, no, you need to go to an hospital that takes African Americans. And while the husband pleaded, begged, they put her on, on a gurney, probably, by the door in the entryway of the hospital when the cold was coming. And the husband tried to talk to the supervisor, finally reached the top administrator, one of the top administrators of the hospital. And the answer was still the same: sorry, we have to go by our rules. We are terribly sorry, but we cannot treat this patient. Take her to other hospital across town. Well, by the time that they got the taxi, the lady got across town, got to the hospital, she died. And it was a terrible uproar in Adventist world, not only African American congregations, but everyone in the church, up the way to the General Conference. People were horrified. How could this happen? How can we treat people like that? A fellow believer, a lady that had been an Adventist for 42 years or 41 years. Does the church have a corporate responsibility? Do Adventist organizations, congregations, hospitals have a responsibility to go and do likewise, to treat people with love, with care, with compassion? Well, let me tell you a happier story. I was able to witness this story while I was a student at Newbold. While at Newbold, I was involved at Newbold in England. I was involved in two ministries. One was the outreach to the prisons. Every Sabbath afternoon, a young lady from Finland, her name was Vicky, and I would go to a prison and we would visit prisoners there. Not so much to give Bible studies. Yes, we talked about our faith, what we believed, but basically to give them encouragement and especially to encourage them to start a new life. My partner in the prison ministry had also another very active ministry, which was prayer bands. We could call it prayer groups. And we had it both in the girls' dorm, in the boys' dorm. I think in the women's dorm there were more people praying together. And one day there was a young lady, an American lady. I don't think that she came at the first semester. She came kind of in the middle of the year. And I'm not going to provide her name, her real name, but let's call her Mary. Mary, from the moment she arrived, it was obvious that she had some trouble. And she was trying to come to an Adventist institution to find a way to reorient her life. And I don't know about how much she shared about her life with the girls in the dorm, but Vicky came to me and said, we really have to pray for this young lady. She has terrible struggles. She has deep emotional wounds to overcome, and she needs all the support, all the compassion that we can give. And so I had minor interaction with this young lady, Mary. But I could sense in her way, the way she looked, the expression on her face, that there were some shadows of the past, or maybe the present, troubling her. And basically, all I did was to pray for her. At Newbold College, we had a tradition, something that I really loved, is that once every semester, everybody, all the students, they were not forced to, they were invited to attend a concert of classical music in one of the great music halls of London. And that will be the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the Royal Orchestra, some top orchestra that will be performing. And it was kind of a simple process. We all be assigned a bus. There will be a teacher on each bus that will be in charge, take care of, or with a roster to make sure that everybody was accounted for. We'd go to the concert. At the end of the concert, we would meet at a point in time at a parking spot, any place where the buses could come. We'd board the buses and would come back. Now, just before the buses left, I looked at Mary and I sensed that there is some kind of anguish in her face. Well, she was not going to my bus. I just hope that maybe she will sit with someone that would comfort her, would encourage her. And I didn't think much about it until the end of the concert. Everybody was in the buses, and but except one person, Mary. She didn't show up. And she was not on my bus, she was on another bus, but the president came and said, well, I want all of you to leave. I will stay here. I will wait, whatever it takes, until she comes. And so it was about 11:30 at night, or past 11 at night. All the buses left. And the president of Newbold College stayed by himself, that street, that stop, waiting for Mary. About 2 o'clock in the morning, Mary showed up, and Mary showed up drunk. And so by then, all the last train from Newbold, from London to Bracknell, that was the closest railway station, had left. So there was no public transportation. The president had to call a taxi and took her to the dorm, left her at care of the Dean of Women. Next day at breakfast, I talked to Pevicki, and Pevicki says, well, everybody's saying that the girl is going to be expelled. And it is so tragic, because just at the time she was trying to make a change in her life, this happened. And so Pevicki and I had a moment of prayer, and then we decided, okay, we are going to talk to the president and see if he can have some mercy on her. Now, all of us, and that were students at that college, and this happens in any Seventh-day Adventist college, had to sign a document that say that we understood that alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and a number of other infractions were grounds for termination, for expulsion. So, you know, that was what the rule said, and if the things follow the normal procedures, that's what have happened. She knew that she was at risk of being expelled. She had disobeyed the rules, and that's what she deserved. So before the office of the president was open, even before the secretary was in her office, Vicky and I were at the door begging for an urgent appointment with the president. And so we could not see the president right away. He had other commitments, but he received us that very morning. And Vicky did most of the talking, explaining, well, this is somebody in crisis. She came to Newbold College, to an Adventist institution, hoping that she would receive enough support to straighten up her life. Something happened that really distressed her, and it happened that she was not on campus at that moment. She was in London, and instead of going to the concert hall, she went to the bar, and then trying to find some relief in alcohol. And the president said, well, you don't need to be troubled. She is not going to be expelled. She and I had a talk last night in the taxi, and this morning I talked again with her. We had a father-daughter talk. And I told her, this is the president speaking, that she would have a second chance. We want to support her and want her to give her life to Christ. And I personally committed myself to spend time with her. There is a female teacher that has been assigned to her as her mentor, and we hope for the best. Now, that the president of the college, you probably are familiar with, his name was Jan Paulson, that went on to become secretary of the Northern European Division, I believe, president of that division, vice president of the General Conference, and then for a number of years, a president of the General Conference. Well, so yes, in a sense, he made a personal choice, but in a sense, it was a corporate choice. An institution that has its rules, but decided to take the compassionate path, the uplifting path, the redeeming path, instead of throwing the regulations at her and following the book. Well, I think in both cases, the people involved in both incidents had choices to make. Should we follow the rules, the traditions, or is there a higher principle that we should follow? The go and do likewise principle that should be followed. In the case of Jan Paulson, that's one of the reasons that I have such a great admiration for him. He chose the path of compassion. And I could go on and on with other stories, people that struggle, students that struggle with different issues. They know that even if everybody else would condemn them, they could go to the president, talk openly, and the president of that college would be somebody that would take time off his busy schedule to pray with that student, to give counsel, and to treat that student as if it was his son or daughter. Well, now if I hope that these two stories, the striking contrast between the two stories, I don't know if in the end, after the school year, what had happened to Mary, and if she continued to be a Christian. But one thing that I know is that she could never say that she left Newbold. I was in need, and people did not have compassion in relation to me in regards my own case. So if we look at the stories and we say, yes, as a church, we have an obligation, a response to give to that invitation from Jesus, go and do likewise. How do we, as a church, do likewise? Are we going to go around trying to find people that have been beaten by robbers? How do we implement this principle? Well, I think that there are several guidelines that are provided in the Bible that do not spell in total detail what we should do, but give us some kind of framework about what we should do. So I'm going to suggest to you at least four possible guidelines about how, as a church, we could respond to this invitation of Jesus to go and do likewise. I'm not going to read the text, but I would like, if you want to look up in your Bibles, what is written in Matthew 25, chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. Matthew 25, chapter 31 to 46. And what Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's talking about the judgment day. And once he talks about the judgment day, it is a little bit strange, especially for Seventh-day Adventists that are so concerned about doctrine, about the purity of belief, that the way that Jesus summarizes the Judgment Day, there is no mention about the Sabbath, there is no mention about tithe, there is no mention about a lot of Christian practices that are referred elsewhere in the Bible. But what Jesus tries to do, at least from my perspective, is to compare. This is the character of God, and this is the way that you, the believers, you, my followers, should represent the character of God. And let me remind you of some of the things that he says. For this, the king, speaking about God the Father, say to those on his right, come, you are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance. The kingdom for you has been prepared since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. So, in a way, what I think that what Jesus is saying is, if you want to go and do likewise, if you want to live a life of compassion, a life that reveals in everything that you do the character, the love and compassion of God, you have to look at the needs of the people around you, be compassionate, respond to those needs, do the most uplifting, caring thing that you can do. Guideline number 2. Serve your neighbors, serve your community. And I take this statement, the spirit of this statement, from Mark chapter 10, verse 45, that says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. So, when Jesus came to this world, just remember about the place he was born, the way he dealt with people, and if you follow his ministry up to the end, do you remember what happened in the Last Supper? If you are acquainted with the Jewish culture, the idea of feet washing of the feet before a ceremonial meal or when the guests would arrive, was given to a slave, to a servant, or the person with the lowest rank in the household. It was the work of a slave. So when the disciples were a bit confused about how they should take the meal, because before taking the meal they should be ritually clean, and somebody should wash their feet, and there was no slave around. Who did the washing of the feet? Jesus. Well, and in a way that I'm glad that our church keeps this ritual, this reminder of humility, that we are to serve each other. And there are not too many churches that observe that ordinance, but we do. I'm very proud of our church for it. But as proud as I am of the fact that before our communion service we participate in the ordinance of humility, the most important fact is that in relation to the community, I'm not suggesting that we go from door to door and ask people, please, can I wash your feet? No, it's not the point, and don't take me wrong. But as we deal with the members of our community, the neighbors, the people around us, what opportunities of service are there? In the children's story, I told what happened to me when I was a stranger in France, and that a little girl came by to teach me French, and she saw the need, and she helped me. She had compassion in relation to me. Now, the needs can be many, and if you talk to somebody that is well acquainted with the community around us, Clear Lake is a town with exceedingly beautiful places, the lake and so forth, but with a lot of human tragedies. And if there is an opportunity for Christian service, for people to be acquainted with the love of God and with hope, the hope of a Christian life should be this town. Guideline number 3. Deal with the people and the community around you in a way that restores life to the fullest. One thing sometimes we lose track of is that, yes, Christ gave us to give us eternal life, but he came also to teach us how to live a fuller life while we are here on this earth. And I read from John 10:10. I have to come that they may have life, and that have it to the full. Other translations say, I have come so that you may have an abundant life. So, could be things that restrict, that because of our sinful condition, that take away our capabilities, sickness, suffering, whatever, if it is within our possibilities to make a change for the better in the life of the people around us, that's what we should do. Take a redeeming approach to the existence of people around us. Restore them to the full human capabilities as much as we can. Guideline number 4. Focus where there is suffering and distress. Now, in James, the epistle of James, chapter 1, verse 27, it says, the religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after the orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself from being polluted by this world. Well, if you look at everything else that the Bible says in terms of how we should deal with each other, we can certainly say that, yes, orphans and widows are generally in distress, but they are not only people in distress. As we deal with the homeless, with people that are sick, people that struggle with addictions, people that have been abused, over this, all those are cries of distress that we should respond to. Now, okay, if you talk to somebody that has really lived here for many years, that has observed this city, they will tell you there are so many needs. How we cannot change everything. We are almost like a drop of water by a lake. We cannot, our possibilities are so limited in relation to the infinite needs that we see around us. Where do we start? What do we do? How do we set our priorities? Well, these are things, answers that I don't have the full responses now, but I would like to suggest some possible responses. And before I go any further, I would like to ask the people that have received the handouts to come forward and to distribute them. I'm going to share with you an handout that basically is a very short summary of the things that Hannah and I learned as we took 1 week to learn about community services. What Adventist community service should do, how they should operate, how much should they do, where they could get started. So some of the things I put in and out, some of the things I'm going just to tell you. But in the handout, I used some of the key thoughts that were presented to us at the training about community service. The context was this: if we, as a congregation, want really to respond to the appeal of Jesus, go and do likewise, how do we go about it? And there is one part we agreed that I will talk about that in a moment, but I wanted to ask you to look at the part where there is text, quotations, Bible verses. So what you will see there by Bible passages and quotes from the writings of Ellen White talking about what we as a church should do to restore human beings to their full potential. And that's really what the most important aspects of the outreach to those in distress. I'm not going to take time to read all the quotes, but I would like to summarize to you what 4 steps that in the training that we received from the General Conference, what they suggested that we do. They suggested the following, and this is not in the handout. First of all, survey the needs of your community. They say, go around, walk around, drive around, talk to people. Make sure that you have looked at every neighborhood and that you have a full grasp what are the problems that affect your community, what are the greatest needs. And they suggest that to interview people that work either in social work or in health services or maybe in the education area, teachers, people that have a close connection with the well-being or the problems of the community, and try to make an inventory. What are the greatest needs of this community? Step 2, appoint a committee of 4 to 6 people to gather all the information, analyze it, and formulate a plan out of all the needs that we have in the community. And we cannot address every single need, but what can we do? And so create a plan in terms of the way that you as a church, or we as a church, can become a blessing to this community and a better witness about the love of God. And then select a few projects. We should not overextend ourselves and try to do too much, especially if we are talking about a small church with limited resources. And the point number 4, and I think it is the most important, mix and mingle. In the handout that you have, there are some references to the fact that Jesus mixed with the people. Actually, right in the middle of the handout, in the bold and underlined, it says, the Savior mingled with men. In the training that we received, a message that came about again and again is the idea that we are the salt of the earth. Now, all of us that have done some cooking know that putting the salt beside the food does not make any change. What really makes a change in the way the food tastes is when the salt is totally mixed with the food. So, in a sense, what it may imply in practical terms is that we are to be so intermingled with the service to the community that we bring a flavor, we bring a transformation, we bring a change, we make a difference. Now, on the back of your handout, there is a grid, and this is just an example of ministries that we could engage on. It's not a full list. It means that if we so choose, if the conditions are ripe for that, we should think about ministries that are not listed here. And we may not be able to address all the types of ministries that are listed here. But what we cannot do is to be indifferent. As in the story of the Good Samaritan, there was the priest and the Levite that passed by. They looked. Did they do anything? No, they continue. So that's the example that we do not want to follow. I would like to read with you the last quote here at the bottom of this page. This was something that was read to us several times. And if we forget about everything else that I said today, I hope that you remember this quote from Ellen White. There is a need of coming close to people by personal effort. If less time were given to sermonizing and more time were spent in personal ministry, greater results would be seen. The poor are to be relieved, the sick cared for, the sorrowing and the bereaved comforted, the ignorant instructed, the inexperienced counseled. We are to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those that rejoice, accompanied by the power of persuasion, the power of prayer, the power of the love of God. Now, listen to this. This work will not, cannot be without fruit. I repeat, this work will not, cannot be without fruit. Somebody has said, and I was not being able to track the origin of this saying, and there are many variations, so I cannot claim to be the source. But I think that a thought that encapsulates everything that we have just discussed is this: preach always about the love of God. When necessary, do you remember the quotes? Use words. So, which means that, yes, we are supposed to be preaching about the love of God. But don't think that the words are the most important thing. Meeting the needs, expressing in the way you live, the way you relate to the community around you, the love of God, it's really the best form of preaching. If I can share a bit of a dream that I have for each church, and I certainly not the only one that are dreams for this church, but the dream would be this, that yes, while I am very glad and very proud of the fact that at least according to my way of thinking, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the church that most closely follows the teachings of the Bible, that everything that the Bible preaches we follow. But I wish that we could say that the message that the community gather around or get from the way we practice our faith would be that when they think about all the churches that are in Clear Lake, that they could say, if you want to see a church that really lives the love of God in the way that they minister, not only to each other, but to the community around, that is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I don't want to steal the thunder from Susan Jen, and I hope that you don't mind referring to some of your dreams. Very few towns of this size have an hospital, a school, and a church. And so we have three different ways of witnessing, of providing service to this community. And I think it's time for us to pull our resources together. Now, we cannot do much about hospitality. It is an independent entity, and we cannot go over there and tell them what they should do. But as a congregation, we have very much control about we as a church, what we do, what ministries we engage in, and what kind of service do we provide to the community. And the school being part of this community will be the same. And I was thinking that part of the education, one of the concepts that has been now very much discussed in higher education, and I think that idea could filter down to elementary education as well, is the idea of service learning. What about if in our schools, maybe once a month or once a quarter or whatever, the children will participate in service to the community, either visiting the elderly or visiting the sick, or something that would be meaningful to them, and learn from elementary school the joy of service, the possibilities of implementing the invitation of Jesus when he talked to the lawyer, and said, "Go and do likewise." I would like to end with a thought of hope, with a promise that of God that is stated in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. I believe that the plans that God has for our church are plans not to be the most, the richest, the most glorious church, but the plan of service, the plan for us to become the church that more faithfully represents the love of God to the community around us.